Hello, my name is Sigurd Neubauer, and I'm the founder and publisher of Man and Culture. It is my pleasure to welcome Karl Voglmayr of Washington Landmark Construction today. He has an impressive record in historic preservation, which includes helping restore several architectural crown jewels at National Park Seminary, a historic community in suburban Maryland, idyllically located off Rock Creek Park, where Silver Spring, Chevy Chase, and Kensington meet. He is an award-winning developer and a popular member of the National Park Seminary community. If you haven't read our feature on Voglmayr, I encourage you to do so. It can be found on manandculture.com. Today, we're going to focus on historic preservation in general and what it takes to enter this field in particular. Welcome, Karl.
Thank you.
In our feature review, we discuss your journey and impressive accomplishments at NPS. Today, let's discuss the industry aspect of historic preservation. Please help our listeners understand what historic preservation is, what it takes to enter this space, and ultimately, what it takes to succeed.
Thank you. Well, the industry aspect of historic preservation is very hard for a neophyte to understand, especially one that has never done construction before. Not only do you need to build a building inside of an existing building, but you have to tie those two together. And it's a very difficult concept for tract home builders or apartment builders to understand. Every single wall needs some clarification to what we're doing with the framing. For instance, you take the plaster off the wall, you have existing framing, you have exterior stucco that can't be touched, and it isn't like you can throw it up quickly. You need to sister every piece, make it level, combine 3 or 4 planes, if you can imagine, horizontal and 2 verticals going into a corner. You don't just use a level. Many of these buildings you find with floors that are off 3 or 4 inches, but that's the beauty. The beauty is that if you have a skill like mine, you can literally determine that the building that you're wanting to purchase is actually worthless because there's so much more work that needs to go into it to stabilize it and to drive your income stream. So, obviously, there are other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you're in that process and you're obviously in touch with regulators, the Historical Preservation Office in whatever jurisdiction you're in, how does that typically work? Does it mean that they come and literally stand looking over your shoulder to make sure that every wall that goes in is in accordance to guidelines, or how does that work in reality?
Yeah, first and foremost, you need an idea. Again, you need to take a building that now needs to become a home that, ostensibly was a gymnasium or a firehouse or a music hall. And often those walls that would constitute the demising partitions between the units, they don't exist at all. An example would be the basketball court that we inherited at the gymnasium project at the National Park Seminary that we did. And those walls are now literally dividing up a gigantic cavernous space. There's nothing historically preserved there, right? So they really focus on the outside of the building, the windows, the stucco, the entablature, the roof, just to name a few things. And their decks and porticos and rails that all are reviewed. And often some of these aspects of these buildings don't even exist when we get there. Like there'd be a entire facade fallen down. And we would go back and we would, provide drawings and photographs of maybe the building previously and details that are very specific that would show every window how we're doing the stucco, what material we're using for entablature. For instance, the entablature of these buildings that were built 100 years ago is tin. No one's making tin entablatures, so they let you use galvanized, which obviously lasts longer. And then there's a lot of give and take. But as historic preservation professional, the biggest thing you need to stay in this arena is to deliver what you promise. If you promise you're going to strip the columns and paint them 3 coats with Benjamin Moore paint, for instance, and you don't strip the columns and you paint it with the cheapest paint from Home Depot and they find out, they're not going to trust you on the next detail.
Yeah, that leads us to the next question, Karl, and that is that please help me understand the biggest challenges as well as opportunities for small and medium developers to compete in this arena.
First and foremost, you need friends, family, or fools to give you some seed money. If you're buying a decrepit building wherever, you're obviously going to need to start renovating it. And you probably will need in the first deal 20 to 25% of the total expenditure, and that would include interest payments and closing costs. And people don't realize these things. So that would be one of the bigger ways.
And then once you were in that marketplace, do you just go out and scout for buildings for business development?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, they come and find me. I mean, I'm doing probably, I did 5 million in sales 4 out of the last 7 years. The gaps in those years are me getting them ready for market. So we're about to do another 2 years of 5 million each, probably plus. And, we do one at a time. I mean, they're all consuming. I've got a degree in economics and I've won a architecture and design award. I mean, it isn't like I set out to win an architecture and design award. I set out to get the building built to its highest standard and also to put things into the building that people want. The 6-burner Bertazzoni stove, the carrier heating system, the Kohler plumbing fixtures, the 2 inches of concrete that I pour on the floor. We're not building apartments, we're building condominiums. My biggest thing is, not biggest, but one of them is that when I see you at Starbucks, you're going to say hello, or I'm going to ask if you'd like to have coffee with me. We don't burn bridges. And
So
it's your
personal integrity is a big line in the work of home construction and historic preservation.
I think so. If you're a small to medium developer, I mean, they're really far and few between in comparison to what they used to be. It's a business where people lose their shirt without knowing. You think you can build it out of wood, and the next thing you're spending $300,000 in steel. Yeah, that's a very hard thing for people that don't have pockets and architectural and design experience, because with that experience, you can find space in these buildings, specifically attics, basements, dig them out, underpin the space, create window wells so that people can escape if needed, but also bringing light into these lower areas. And all of this needs to be negotiated, but life safety trumps historic preservation, right?
Absolutely.
So, we are going to have sprinkler systems. We are going to have a staircase that has a 7-inch rise and an 11-inch depth somewhere in the building to get out safely, instead of the curved stairs that, regularly reside in these historic buildings.
And yeah, you have been in historic preservation for the past 20 years. And please help share with our viewers about some of your experiences up to date. What has been your greatest challenge from securing approvals from regulators to carrying out construction?
I would have to say my biggest challenge was my first project. We didn't know what was to happen the next day because we'd never been there before. So my first project, I purchased a 5-story brownstone in DuPont Circle right on 17th Street, which is a incredible area today. It was an okay area then. And Edwardian facade on the exterior, the same high iron content brick with the buttered joints that you would see on the Iraqi embassy, believe it or not. They were built in the same neighborhood, and obviously the same builder built the 2 houses. A circular Roman stone window in the front that was 10 feet by 10 feet. A most incredible building. And to get my first seed money, I had to convince my parents. I was 26 years old. I told my parents, please don't take any deep breaths and let's go to the roof. And we went straight to the roof. And they're like, well, why are you taking us to the roof? Because I said, this is the only good view in the place. It had been turned into a boarding house, rooming house, 5 apartments in this 1-story home. We uncovered behind walls dumbwaiters that we turned into showers, stacked showers. There was unbelievable depth to this place as well, where we could store things. And I renovated every single apartment, moving after renovating it to the next one, while starting my construction company and just finishing up at Johns Hopkins. And, I had no social life for approximately 2 or 3 years while that occurred. It was not a great time for the American economy, the early 90s. I mean, people didn't invest like they do now in real estate. But at any rate, we stabilized the building. Eventually, it was turned back into a single family home with a lower level where the servants used to live back in the day. The house was built in 1896, and it still pays dividends today. I mean, I sold that investment. I was 28 years old, and I put all of the proceeds into a simple municipal bond ladder, and it pays me monthly. A beautiful check that I don't owe taxes on. Important.
Incredible, incredible. So this leads
Yeah.
us to our final question, Karl. What is next for you? Do you have national aspirations? And what is your next project?
Yeah, that's very nice of you to think that I would even consider national aspirations. I'm a boy from Australia that grew up in Massachusetts, and Tip O'Neill was one of my favorite politicians. And he did say it's all local. The
Uh-huh.
further you're away from one of these projects, the boots are on the ground, the less management by walking around. This is how I keep my insurance rates down. I'm probably in the office 70% of the time, but the other 30% of the time I'm on the road. I mean, I am the undercover boss specifically, and I plan on doing something even harder than ever before, which is the Warner Circle Mansion condominiums. We're planning to put 16 condos in the middle of this 3 to 4 acre park in Kensington that was built in 1896, I think, initially by a developer by the name of Brainard Warner, who developed most or a lot of the West End in DuPont Circle, all those incredible brick buildings, 21st, 22nd Street. And we're going to create a carriage house that will include a fitness center, also a community room. And that's how we're paying back the community for allowing us to renovate the space. We are letting the community use the fitness center community room 6 times a year for their events. And it's an open park. People are coming and going. There's no fencing, for instance. Maybe there'll be shrubbery, but there won't be any fencing. And it's a new concept. In the United States, we are lacking housing. And the reason we're lacking housing is because no one wants a development next to them. But here, they didn't know what to do with the building. It's starting to fall down. The county bought it as an investment to the open green park reality that Montgomery wants. They removed a 50,000 square foot Soviet style nursing home. And it looks as if this building that I'm going to be taking on looks as if someone punched it in the mouth on one end because it's missing something. So we're going to add that missing piece. We're going to utilize some economics of scale, which is necessary. It's pretty hard to do a condominium complex with 4 units or 8 units. You need some economics of scale, especially with the fees that you need to pay monthly once you are a member. But one of the neatest aspects, and we can close after this, Siggy, is that I'm allowed to create a foyer that will have a beautiful baby grand piano set off on a ledge a little higher than the rest of the foyer. And in that foyer, there will be all sorts of ornate woodwork, but also it will be a museum to Brainard Warner because he was a developer in 1896 that had a vision. And, I'm akin to that. And when I say that he had a vision, his vision was let's get out of the west end of DuPont where we're near swamps and so forth, and let's move the family and so forth up to Kensington. Let's find a hill, let's build a house, and let's invite our friends to become our neighbors. And that's what this guy did. Surrounding the park are all of these beautiful Victorian homes interspersed with some ranchers. But this is America. So
No, this is fascinating, and for our listeners, you will see pictures while this conversation is recorded, also of the Warner Mansion that Karl Voglmayr is about to restore. So, with that, I want to thank you, Karl, very much for your time, and all of us will be looking forward to seeing how your next construction projects unfolds. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you, Ziggy.
Welcome back. It is my pleasure to welcome Bonnie Rosenthal of Save Our Seminary. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Siggy.
Please describe your role at SOS. How did you get involved, and what does SOS do today?
Well, my role with SOS, or Save Our Seminary, is currently as the part-time executive director, which I have been for a number of years. Before that, I was the president of the board, but I've been involved with Save Our Seminary SOS since 1989, over 30 years now. How did I get involved was my husband and I moved to a nearby neighborhood, Forest Glen, the other side of the Beltway, in 1988. And we were walking around the nearby neighborhood and we came across this property, and I was just entranced and found out that shortly after, in 1989, they were giving tours of the site. And I went on a tour, and essentially I never left. I got involved immediately with the very newly formed organization and just stayed and got very involved, obviously. SOS today, well, when SOS started out, it was very much advocating for saving the seminary. And we did hands-on kind of work, such as security, securing the buildings, trying to do what we could as amateurs to stabilize some of the buildings where people had broken in. But now what we're doing is really, we've gotten through that phase of saving the buildings. And we are now focusing on sharing the history and the stories about this enchanting, unusual place. And we do that through the history, through our guided tours that we give monthly, special programs that we present on different aspects of the history. And we've also published a book of the history of the site. We are also still doing some hands-on preservation work, such as restoring the sculpture, the various pieces of sculpture that still exist on the campus, as we can raise the funds to do so. And we're also recently concentrating on the wooded ravine that covers a significant part of the property called the Glen. And so we're looking at how we can help preserve and bring back that green space for others to enjoy.
Yeah, it's really terrific. And for somebody who has known the property really since the beginning, 1989, as you mentioned, 30 years ago. And we have also talked to another member of the community who used to come here as a child in the 1950s, and help us go through what it looked like back then in the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Oh, gosh. We Well, the Army had boarded up windows and openings to some of the buildings, or most of the buildings probably, but others were left just uncovered. They were locked, but uncovered, but very much in various stages of deterioration, peeling paint, rotten wood. There were times when there was steam heat, radiator heat in the buildings, but the Army obviously had turned off the heat, and what that caused was broken pipes, water pipes. So it was not unusual to find water running down a hallway, for instance, or even out onto the street if it got that bad, which it did happen at one time. But very derelict looking buildings. And there were over 24 buildings, from a house size building to a big 3-story large building. So they all had levels of deterioration with, peeling paint inside and out, collapsed floors. There was a time when I was in one of the houses and walked into a room and put my leg through the floor. That was scary. So it was pretty run down.
Yeah, and for our listeners, of course, as we speak, they can take a look at the various pictures of the reconstruction, both of the buildings before and after. So given your experience at that time, where would you say, what was the hardest part about beginning this process?
I guess, first of all, getting the Army to do the most basic stabilization work. In other words, closing up some of the buildings better than they had, following up on dealing with the broken pipes and so on. There were some times when water would be running for days, literally. I spent a lot of time communicating with the Army facilities person to try to get those things taken care of. So that was probably the hardest and most frustrating. Later on,
you run into red tape everywhere.
Yes, exactly. Right. And then, and their excuse, well, they don't have the money and the funding, and they were a medical facility, so that was where their priority was, which we understood. But they also owned this property and they were responsible for it and its condition.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remind our listeners today that pre 9/11, this entire area was not fenced in, so people could just walk around at their own leisure.
Yes, and that was an issue dealing with vandals. They like old abandoned buildings, so they try to break in. And we caught young kids with skateboards in the ballroom one day. Running through the ballroom with their skateboards, and we actually caught another man breaking in to steal some tools that were still in the building. So that was a very frustrating, difficult time to keep up with the vandalism.
Yeah, and if you look at the community, the uniqueness of National Park Seminary, do we know or do you know if any similar communities exist around the country, or is this just unique to our area?
Well, I think what makes this property unique is its architecture, its collection of all the different international styles. And there probably is not any other place in the country like this because of that architecture, other than perhaps Epcot Center by Disney down in Florida. As a historic community, because it was a school campus, it kind of is a natural neighborhood unto itself. So, there are historic neighborhoods in towns and cities and so on that are just residential. This property is a combination of different types of buildings, not just the architecture, but, we have a gymnasium, we have a power plant, we have small houses, we have large buildings. So making all of that work together in a modern functional way was important and makes it unique, I think, in that respect.
Yeah, and finally, what is your takeaway from NPS as a model for historic preservation?
Well, I think one thing I learned very early was you need to involve all of the stakeholders in a process like this. We had to deal, because it was owned by the Army, we had to deal at the federal level, we had to deal at the state level, we had to deal at the county level, and then at the very local, in other words, the neighborhood surrounding the property. So we brought all those parties together, and that, I think, was very crucial to make this project and this property a success, a preservation success. The other thing is three things that kind of stuck out in my mind as we went through this now, or my involvement for 30 years, was passion. You have to have passion to want to do this and make it happen. You have to have perseverance, because dealing with all of the levels of government and that process and the red tape and whatever, you have to persevere through all of that if you really have the passion. And then lastly, I think you have to have patience, because it took literally years to get the Army to finally dispose of the property, almost 10 years of process. So I look at passion, perseverance, and patience as the three takeaways from this particular property.
And that is certainly something that other developers, especially those interested in historic preservation elsewhere, should keep in mind.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Very welcome. Glad to speak to you, Siggy.